The women of Havre Creek stitched their names into her quilt the day she left. And for 60 years, she wondered why one square stayed empty. Slower on the corners, girls. This one has to last her whole life out west. The quilting frame stood square in the middle of the parlor, and around it, in the yellow lamplight, the needles were already moving, down and through, up and through, that small silver dip and rise that women's hands had made in warm rooms for 100 years. The one who had spoken was Prudence, and when Prudence spoke at a Quilting Bee, it was the frame itself speaking. She kept the circle the way some men keep a store, a clean white collar, a decided mouth, and an eye that let no crooked stitch by her twice. On the frame lay a quilt of 30 squares, calico madder red, deep indigo, plain cream, 6 across and 5 down. In some of the squares, names already stood, worked in fine dark chain stitch. Most of the squares were waiting. Nobody in that warm room had yet said the word goodbye. The bee was too loud with talk and too bright with lamplight for that word. But every woman at the frame knew why the corners had to be slow, and every one of them sewed like she knew it. The quilt was the goodbye. It was late in the summer of 1878, in the weak country of Dakota Territory, and the parlor smelled of lamp oil and strong coffee and new cotton cloth. Scraps lay heaped on the side table like a spilled harvest. Madder red, indigo, cream, the same 3 colors over and over, because Prudence had decreed 3 colors and no circus. Thread hissed through calico. Somebody's thimble tapped its small tin heartbeat. Outside the open window, the wheat stood ripe to the world's edge, gone gold as lamplight itself, and the evening came in warm across the sills. There is no better sound on this earth, if you want to know what a town's love sounds like, than a quilting bee at full work. A dozen soft voices, a dozen needles, and laughter going around the frame, the way wind goes around a field. But at the far edge of the lamplight, past where the talk reached, one woman sat apart. She had a chair by the wall and her own sewing in her lap, and she was not at the frame, and no one called her to it. Keep her in the corner of your eye. This story does. It was the eldest of the circle who put the first name in. She had buried 2 husbands and raised 8 children, and caught half the babies in that valley with her own 2 hands. And when she pulled her chair to the frame, the talk fell away on its own, the way it does when a room understands that something is starting. She chose a madder red square near the middle. She threaded her needle at arm's length because her eyes were long past close work. And somebody laughed, and she laughed too. And then letter by letter, a stitch at a time, she worked her own name into the cloth. It is a slow thing, chain stitching a name, and the room watched the whole of it. The dark thread looping, the letters standing up one by one out of the red. When she had knotted off, she smoothed the square flat with her thumb, the way you smooth a child's hair. There, she said. Now wherever you sleep, girl, I'm there before you. That was the first name. 28 more would follow it, and 1 square never would. But the room did not know that yet, and the evening was warm, and the lamp burned steady, and for now every square on that frame was a promise still waiting to be kept. You will want to know what it was they were making, for the custom has mostly gone out of the world. It was the custom of those years on the prairie that when a family left a settlement for good, and families were always leaving, west and further west, The women of the place made a signature quilt for the wife who was going. Every woman of the circle took one square and worked her own name into it with needle and thread. Piece the squares together and you had, when it was done, something no store ever sold. A warm thing with the whole town's names on it, to go where the family went, so that a woman 1,000 miles from every voice she knew could spread her friends across a bed at night and sleep under them. Prudence said it plainest that evening, tapping the frame with her thimble finger. Every stitch is a name. A quilt like this, you can read who loved you. Remember that sentence. It will come back to you near the end of this story, changed by 60 years. And it will mean something none of the women at that frame could have guessed. The quilt was for Ellen Hartley, and Ellen Hartley was 24 years old. She sat at the frame with the rest, because Prudence held that a woman ought to help sew her own goodbye. It kept the weeping down, she said, to keep the hands busy. Ellen was a slender young wife, with steady hazel eyes and honey brown hair braided close around her head, like a crown, and she had grown from girl to woman in Havre Creek, married in its white church, settled on its wheat, known by name in every kitchen on that road. Havre Creek was a Scandinavian settlement mostly, Norwegians and Swedes and Danes who had crossed an ocean for this flat gold country, with a sprinkling of Yankee families like Ellen's own mixed in. It was not a rich town, but it was a warm one, in the way of towns where everybody's first winters had been hard, and nobody had forgotten it. And Ellen was leaving it, not for land, and not for gold, for a quieter reason that nobody at the frame said out loud. The reason stood out in the yard that evening, drawing water he did not need to draw, because a sick man would rather haul a full bucket than sit still and be looked at. Jacob Hartley was 28, tall and going thin, and through the open window, under the talk and the laughter, you could hear it every little while. A low, careful cough, held down the way a man holds down a startled horse. He had been coughing since spring. The doctor had listened a long time to his chest and said, in the end, one word that mattered: dry. A drier country, higher, drier air, and a man his age might yet make old bones. Stay in the river damp, and the doctor had not finished that sentence, and this story will not finish it either. So they were going west, before the snow, to the high dry country, away from every name that was, at that very hour, being stitched into a quilt to follow them. Through that evening, and the evenings after, the squares filled. The midwife put her name below the first one. She had caught Ellen herself, 24 years back, and said so twice. The neighbor, who had taught Ellen to keep a sourdough alive through January, worked her name in slow, careful letters, and declared that the recipe went with it. A girl of 17, whom Ellen had minded as a baby, stitched her name crooked, picked it half out, and stitched it again. And her mother told her a crooked name kept truest, being hardest won. And the frame laughed, and the girl let it stand. Square by square, the quilt became what it was meant to become. Not cloth, a town. Women who had stood up at each other's weddings and sat down at each other's tables. Women who had waited out fevers together, and blizzards, and grasshopper summers. 29 names, when it was done, out of 30 squares. Those were the warm hours of this story, and it does not hurry through them. The coffee went around again. The lamp was trimmed. talk was of the road west, and how long a letter took to travel, and whether the new country would have decent neighbors in it. And under the talk, the needles never stopped. Dip and rise, dip and rise, patient as breathing. By the time the frost talk started and the shawls went on, better than 20 squares carried names. And if you had thought to count the women of that circle against the squares of that frame, you would have found the numbers even. 30 women, 30 squares. 1 square for every woman in Havre Creek who had a claim on Ellen Hartley's remembering. Even the one at the edge of the lamplight, with her own sewing in her lap, whom nobody had yet asked. Her name was Marta Solheim. She was a Norwegian woman in her 40s, big-boned and broad-shouldered, with large, capable hands that had done every kind of work this country asks, and pale flaxen hair going grey at the temples, twisted back under a plain kerchief. She had crossed from Norway years before, with a husband the fevers had since taken, and she farmed her quarter, mostly alone. And she came to the bee when the bee gathered. But she sat where she sat now, at the wall, at the edge, half in and half out of the light. She had English enough for the store and the church, and not a word to spare past that, or so Havre Creek had long ago decided. She was civil. She was clean. She never missed a Sunday. And in 8 years, no one in that town could remember getting a whole sentence out of her that she had not been asked for. In her lap, that evening, was her own work. A plain piece of quilting, close-stitched. Nothing to look at from across a room. On her finger was a small brass thimble, worn to a soft gold shine. Look at that thimble once and remember it. Of everything in this story, it travels farthest. It was Prudence who asked her, "Give Prudence that." She asked. She crossed the parlor with a threaded needle held out before her, and the talk at the frame thinned as she went, because the whole room saw where she was going. She stopped in front of the chair at the wall, and she held out the needle, and she said, kindly enough, the way you speak across a fence, that Marta's square was waiting. Last but one. It ought to have a name in it, same as all the others. It would only take the evening. Marta looked at the needle. She looked for a long moment at the frame in the lamplight, and the bright squares, and the names. Then she shook her head. "No," she said, "just that, low and once." Prudence asked again, gentler the second time, plainer, an honest asking. And Marta shook her head again, and looked back down, and took up her own sewing. And her needle went on with its small, even stitches as if nothing in the room had happened at all. No reason was given. None was offered ever, to anyone, as long as she was known in that town. The room took it the way rooms take such things, quietly and not kindly. 2 women bent together over the far corner of the frame, and their needles kept moving while their voices dropped. "Too proud to put her name beside ours," one said. The other tipped her head toward the chair at the wall. 8 years among us, and hardly 10 words. What did you expect of her? That was all. Nobody raised a voice. Nobody was rude to her face. Havre Creek was not a cruel town. The story means that, honestly, and it matters that you believe it. They were decent women, at a warm frame, on a kind errand. But they had asked one of their own to stand in the circle with them, and been told no, flat, with no reason to soften it. And so the town did, with Marta Solheim, what towns everywhere do, with what they cannot explain. It explained her the easy way. Proud, cold, foreign, suit herself then. The needles dipped and rose, the lamplight held. And the easy explanation settled in over that parlor, like the first thin ice on a pond. There were two quiets in that room now, if you had ears for them. There was the quiet around the frame, which was the quiet of women sewing away an awkwardness, busier than it needed to be, a little loud in its smallness. Past the shears, mind the corner. More coffee, anyone. And there was the quiet at the wall, which did not change at all. Marta's needle kept its own time, even and unhurried, the same after the asking as before it. She did not look up. She did not leave early. She sat where she always sat, sewing what she always sewed. A big still woman at the edge of the light, while across the room a quilt filled up with every name in town but hers. Ellen watched her over the frame, longer than she meant to. She was young, and she was leaving, and she had 100 things to hold in her mind that autumn. But something in that stillness caught at her, the way a single unlit window catches at you on a lit street. She could not have said what it was. For 60 years, she would not be able to say what it was. Here is the one thing that passed between them in all those weeks. It was not words. Very little in this story that matters is. It was at the last bee, but one, when the women laid the frame aside mid-evening and crowded to the kitchen for supper. Ellen came in late behind the others and found herself at the end of the table by the wall, and found, set down in front of her without a sound, a dish of boiled potatoes, gold with butter, salted, steam still standing on them. Marta had cooked them. Marta set them down, big work-worn hands, careful as a girl's with the dish. And when Ellen looked up, the older woman said, in her heavy, careful English, "Eat is a long road, west." 4 words. Ellen would remember every one of them at 84. Then Marta went back to the stove. And that was the whole of it. But Ellen ate those potatoes slowly, with a feeling she had no name for. The feeling of being given something by someone the whole room had agreed had nothing to give. By the last week of September, the quilt was all but done. The squares were joined, the border was on. 29 names stood dark and fine in the madder red and the indigo and the cream. And in the bottom corner, the low right-hand corner, where the pattern came to rest, one square stayed as it had been cut. Blank cream cloth, not a stitch on it. There was talk of filling it some other way. A verse, somebody said. A date. Prudence turned both down with one shake of her head, and her reason was better than she knew. "Leave it so," she said. "It's hers whether she signs it or not. She may yet think better of it before the wagon goes." So the square was left open, a held door, a kept place. And the quilt went to its finishing with 29 names and one silence in the corner. And the days ran down toward leaving, the way days do, faster at the end. The last night, the Hartley house stood half in boxes. The wagon stood loaded high in the yard, plough and seed, the iron stove cold and roped, the clock in a flour barrel, wedding china and straw. Ellen packed the trunk by candlelight. Linens, the good dress, the Bible with the family page in it. And Jacob turned in early behind the quilt-hung doorway. Because the morning would be long, and because lately the evenings tired him. In a way neither of them remarked on out loud anymore. Ellen worked until the candle was low. Then she stood a while in the middle of the little stripped room, listening to her husband breathe, and to the wind in the wheat outside, saying under her breath the small, useless goodbyes you say to a house. Tomorrow the town would say the big one. They gave her the quilt in the parlor, the morning she left, with the whole circle crowded in and the frame folded away at last. Prudence and the eldest held it up open between them, and the morning sun came through the window straight onto it. And Ellen, who had helped sew the thing, who knew every square of it by heart, stood in front of it and lost every word she had prepared. 29 names. Madder red, indigo, cream. The whole of her life till now, spelled out in thread. It had been finished fine, quilted close, edge to edge, backed in plain muslin, that long plain last work having gotten itself done between one gathering and the next, the way such work does in a busy season, by whatever hands found the time. Nobody thought to ask whose. There was too much else that week to think of, with the leaving so near. Ellen took it into her arms like something breathing. The women closed in around her, and there was embracing and wet eyes, and the particular laughter of women who are refusing to cry. And Prudence said, gruff as a wagon axle, that it was only cloth, and to mind she didn't drag it in the mud. It was not only cloth. Everyone in that room knew it. That is why the room was laughing. But at the door, as the circle came out into the morning, the quilt caught the light again, and the talk caught on the corner of it. The blank square in that bright sun was the plainest thing on it, a missing tooth in a smile. And the women looked, the way people cannot help looking, and here and there came that small sound, the click of a tongue, half pity and half judgment, that has traveled with human beings into every country on earth. She couldn't even give her name, one of them said, not loud, loud enough. Marta was in the doorway when it was said. She had come with the rest. She was of the circle, after all, whatever the corner of the quilt had to say about it. And she stood in the door frame with her shawl crossed over her chest and her back went still. Just that. A big woman, standing quite still in a doorway, one heartbeat, two. Then she stepped past the talk and out into the sunlight, and stood at the edge of the crowd, at the edge of things, where she always stood, and whatever there was to see in her face, nobody in Havre Creek was looking at it. The whole town came out for the leaving, because the whole town always did. It was a high gold morning, the wheat standing ripe on both sides of the road, and the sky that enormous harvest blue that Dakota keeps for its goodbyes. The loaded wagon stood at the church corner, with the team stamping, and around it Havre Creek gathered in its Sunday shawls on a Tuesday. The pastor with a psalm, the men with their hats off to Jacob, the women in one long knot around Ellen, saying the things that are always said. Write when you're settled. Mind the river crossings. Come back when the wheat's in someday. Words thrown out like lines to a boat already easing off the bank. And everyone on that road knew how far west a promise carries. Ellen went down the line of faces and hugged the ones she'd known longest, and held her own face steady the way her mother had taught her, and did not quite look at the blue distance past the last house where the road went, because looking at it made it real. Jacob handed her up onto the seat and climbed after, slow, and took the lines. The trunk was roped behind. The crate of hens grumbled under the seat, and on Ellen's knees, folded so the name showed, lay the quilt, too fine to pack away, too new to sit on, so she carried it the way you carry a thing you have not learned yet how to own. From the wagon seat, the crowd was all upturned faces, and Ellen looked down into them and understood. With a lurch, the smile on her face did not show, that this was the last time in her life she would see all these faces in one place. She was right as it happens. 60 years right. Well, said Jacob softly, to the team or to her or to the town. He did not finish it. He was a man who left room at the end of his sentences, and his wife had long since made herself at home in that room. The lines lifted, the team leaned, and that was when the crowd stirred and parted and let someone through. It was Marta. She came through the gathered women the way a plough comes through standing wheat, not fast, not rough, but not to be stopped either. And the talk fell off around her passage into a hush of pure astonishment, because Marta Solheim had never in 8 years pushed to the front of anything. She came straight to the wagon wheel. She reached up, and into Ellen's 2 hands she pressed a small bundle, a scrap of clean flour sacking, tied with sewing thread, no bigger than an egg, and closed Ellen's fingers over it with both of her own. Her hands were rough as fence rails and careful as a midwife's. She held on one moment longer than giving requires. Her jaw was set. Her pale eyes were steady on Ellen's, and wet at the rims, and they stayed steady anyway. She said nothing at all. Then she let go and stepped back from the wheel, and the crowd closed where she had been, and the wagon, because a loaded wagon obeys no moment, rolled. Ellen got the thread untied 100 yards past the church, one-handed, her heart going quicker than she could account for. Inside the flour sacking was a thimble. The brass thimble, the one from the bee, worn to that soft gold shine, its little dents darkened with years of work. Around the base ran a single cut line of ornament, small angular figures marching in a circle, old country figures, the kind carved on trunks and ale bowls in the valleys of Norway. That was all. No note. And then Ellen wondered at herself for even thinking the word note, and could not have said why it felt wrong to expect one. She turned in the wagon seat. Behind them the crowd had loosed into waving handkerchiefs and hats against the gold. But Marta was already outside it, already apart, a tall, still figure at the road's edge who did not wave and did not go in, and only stood watching the wagon grow small. Ellen closed her hand over the thimble. It was warm. It had come off the giver's finger that morning. The wagon passed the last house, and the schoolhouse, and the cemetery with its few white stones, and Havre Creek let them go. The way the land out there lets everything go, gradually, without one clear moment of ending. When Ellen looked back the last time, from the low rise south of town, the street had emptied, and the crowd was gone to its kitchens. Only one figure still stood at the road's edge, small now with distance, dark against the bright stubble. Still there, still watching. Then the road bent with the creek, and the wheat came up between, and the town of Havre Creek, church, street, stones, and the woman standing at the edge of it, slid away behind 60 acres of gold and was gone. They went southwest through the shorn and standing wheat, all that long warm afternoon, the wagon swaying its slow mile after mile, and the dust standing up golden behind them. It is a gentle thing to see, a wagon in ripe country, and this story lets it be gentle a while. The creak of harness, the hens muttering, meadowlarks spilling off the fence lines, Jacob humming half a hymn under his breath when the coughing let him. The great sky wheeled over. The new life lay somewhere ahead, past the haze. And on Ellen's knees, mile after mile, the quilt road folded in the sun. 29 names going west, away from every voice they belonged to. Toward evening, camped by a slough with the fire not yet lit, Ellen spread the quilt across her lap and went over it square by square, tracing each name with one finger, slow, the way you go over a thing you mean to keep. The eldest's name, first in, steady as print. The midwife's. The sourdough neighbors. The girl's crooked one. Stitched twice and prouder for it. Name after name after name. And under her finger each one gave up its face, its kitchen, its voice. Until the quilt was not warm cloth at all, but a road home laid out in thread. And she could walk it any evening of her life. 29 names. She went over everyone. And then her finger came to the bottom corner and stopped. The blank square. Cream cloth, clean as the day it was cut. Not a stitch on it. Ellen sat with her finger resting on that emptiness while the light went red across the slough, and the question stood up in her plainly for the first time. The question this whole story hangs from. 30 women, 30 squares, 29 names. Why? Not why did she refuse? Towns are full of refusals, and most of them mean nothing and are forgotten by threshing time. But a woman who would not put 3 letters of thread into a square had pushed through a crowd to close Ellen's fingers over the thimble of her own hand. Those two things sat side by side and would not agree with each other, like a locked door with a lamp in the window. In one hand, the empty square. In the other, the brass thimble, warm from her pocket. She was 24 years old, on the open prairie, with her whole life ahead of her, and her whole town behind her, holding both halves of an answer she could not put together. She would carry them, square and thimble, question and key, for 60 years. For 60 years that quilt went everywhere we went. Ellen said it, an old woman, to anyone who asked about the faded thing on her lap. And it was the plain truth, said the plain way, which is how the biggest truths mostly get said. It went into the high, dry country lashed to the top of the trunk, and it came off the wagon the first night on their own claim, when the cabin was half a wall and a canvas sheet, and it was the first warm thing spread in the new life. It was on the bed before there was properly a bed. The names of Havre Creek lay down with them, the first night they slept on their own land, 1,000 slow miles from the parlor, where every one of those names had been stitched. Jacob breathed easier in that air, the way the doctor had hoped. The cough that had bent him double by the river settled out there into something a man could carry. The dry country was keeping its half of the bargain, and the quilt kept its half. That is what the years between are in this story. The years the quilt kept its promise, while one square of it kept a secret. The new country made them work for every year of it. There were the proving up years, sod and sweat and borrowed seed, when the quilt was winter's whole argument against the wind. There were the good years after, when the cabin grew a plank floor and then a second room, and the quilt was promoted from necessity to honor, spread on the bed for company, for Sundays, for the doctor's visits, folded back careful every ordinary night. On wash days it went out on the line, and that was a sight Ellen never stopped stopping for, the madder red and the indigo snapping in the prairie wind. 29 names of Havre Creek flying over a country none of those women ever saw. The letters back east grew fewer and farther between, as letters do. Faces she could once call up like her own hand went dim on her. But the names never did. The names were on the bed. Their first child came in the second spring. A daughter, born ahead of the thaw, with a neighbor woman attending who had done it before, and a father pacing the dooryard who had not. And when the small, hoarse crying was done, and the child lay washed and furious in the lamplight, it was the quilt they laid her in. Ellen held her daughter on the names of 29 women. The eldest who had promised there before you, the midwife who had caught Ellen herself. And if a child anywhere in that territory was ever wrapped in more godmothers at one time, history does not mention it. More children followed, as children did then, and every one of them was carried, walked through colic, and rocked to sleep on that same cloth. The quilt stopped being a keepsake somewhere in those years. It became what the women who made it had meant it to be, which is a third parent, patient, always within reach, and smelling faintly of everyone who had ever loved you. There was a fever night. Every family of those years had one, and this story keeps its voice low through it, as the house itself did. Their middle child, a boy then, took a fever one March that climbed through an evening and would not come down. It was the long kind of night. The lamp turned low. The wet cloth changed and changed again. On the small forehead, water at the lips by the spoonful, and the two of them sitting on either side of the bed listening to their son breathe, with the quilt drawn up over him, because it was the warmest thing in the house, and because neither of them could have said out loud what else they meant by it. Somewhere past the dead of night the breathing eased. By grey light the fever had broken, and the boy slept slack and damp-haired and safe under the 29 names. And Ellen, watching him, thought a thought she never told anyone, that she had not sat that night alone, that the whole of a town she could no longer reach had sat up with her, in thread. The century turned. The children grew, the way wheat does, nothing today and gone tall when you next look up. And the quilt wore. That is what quilts are for. The wearing is the loving. The madder red went soft as an old apron. The binding frayed and was replaced. Here and there a square thinned and was patched from beneath. And Ellen's needle. She had the finest needle in that county by then. Everyone said so. Kept it whole through every winter of hard use. One thing she noticed in all those years of mending, without ever quite thinking about it. The top wore, but the quilt held. However hard the children were on it, it never once came apart at the quilting. Those close, even lines of stitching that bound top to batting to muslin back. Once resting her eyes, she ran her thumb across that stitching and thought idly that the circle had finished the thing well. Then a child called, or a kettle did, and the thought went where idle thoughts go. 60 years it would wait there. Jacob Hartley got his old bones after all. The dry country gave him better than 30 years past the doctor's unfinished sentence. Years of wheat and children and evenings on the porch. And this story would like that entered in the account before what comes next. He failed slowly. At the last, in the winter, he turned 60. The old trouble in his chest, come back patient as a creditor. There was a bed by the south window, because he liked the light on the fields. There was the quilt over him, all those winter weeks. He would have the names up around his chin, he said, having slept under them 40 years and not proposing to stop. One February morning the house was quiet, in a way Ellen understood from the stairs. The story stays on the stairs. What needs saying can be said from there. The south window with its shade drawn down against the brightness. The rocking chair on the porch, his chair, standing still in the wind thereafter. And on the bed, drawn up smooth, the way she always drew it. The quilt, covering, as it had covered everything else in their life together, this too. She was 60 years old when she buried him, and she lived on in the house alone. And the quilt changed its work one last time. The children were grown and gone to their own kitchens by then, scattered down the roads of 3 states, home at Christmas, when the trains allowed. The house got the deep quiet that houses get, and through that quiet, on the bed, the names kept their watch, company of a kind that only the old rightly understand. She could put her hand on the eldest's name, or the midwife's, women 40 years under the Dakota grass by then, and be for a moment not alone in the room. All of them there, all but one. She was an old woman, before she caught herself still wondering about the empty square. Some winter nights, lamp low, her hand resting on that blank corner, the way the tongue returns to a broken tooth. 60 years of dirt roads and children and weather had not filled it, and had not worn the question out either. Why had the woman with the warm thimble left her a cold square? She had long since stopped asking it out loud. She had never once stopped asking it. Now the story comes to 1938, and the color goes out of the world. You know why, if your people farmed anywhere on the plains in those years. The dust years, the gray decade, dry fields, dry banks, a sky the shade of an old photograph, and the paint worn off everything including the century. Ellen Hartley was 84. She had outlived her husband, her town of Havre Creek, so she supposed, having had no letter from it in 20 years, and very nearly the age she belonged to. She kept her own small house still, straight-backed at the stove and the sewing basket both. Silver-haired, spectacled for close work, slower than she liked, and neater than ever. And on her lap, that grey October, lay the one thing in the room the dust years had not touched. The quilt, faded yes, soft as breath at the edges, but still against all that sepia, red and indigo and cream. 60 years old and the last bright thing in the house. It needed her needle again. The muslin back had gone thin as newsprint along one edge, and torn cloth waits for no one's convenience. She fetched her spectacles and her sewing basket, and turned the quilt lining side up across her knees. She was, as far as she knew, mending a backing. She was opening a letter 60 years in the mail. The muslin had done its 60 winters honorably, and it showed. Washed to a grey sheen, thin at every fold, and along the north edge, the edge that takes the shoulder's wear, parted at last, a hand's length of the old backing hanging loose from the seam. Ellen went over it in the window light like the surgeon's daughter she wasn't. Patch or replace. A patch would hold a season, but muslin that age is done when it is done. The honest mend was to open the worn section properly, lay new cloth beneath, and set it right once for the years she had left to need it. That meant unpicking. Opening a seam, sewn the summer she was 24. She threaded her needle, set the small scissors by, and settled her spectacles. An old woman at a window, beginning a chore 10,000 old women had begun before her. There is no plainer scene in this whole story. Remember it anyway. Every turning point Ellen Hartley ever met had come to her dressed as a chore. She worked the old seam open stitch by stitch, the way you must. Scissors point under each loop, a lift, a snip, the thread coming away in inch-long pieces grey with age. The seam gave slowly. Whoever had closed it to last. She noticed that with a mender's half-smile, fighting thread 60 years dead that still did not want to let go. a hand's length open. 2. The old muslin loosened along the edge, and behind it showed the wool batting, matted thin by the decades, and the underside of history, the back of the piece top, the reversed ghosts of the squares she knew by heart. She meant only to trim back to sound cloth. She took the loose muslin edge and folded it down, and reached for her chalk to mark the cut. And her hand stopped. The afternoon light was coming low and sideways through the window, the kind of light that finds every ridge in a cloth. And the opened lining, laid over in that light, was not lying flat the way plain muslin lies. It was rippled, fine, close even, worked all over, edge to edge, like sand where the tide has been. She spread the open stretch wide under the window light, and looked, truly looked, spectacles down, nose down, the way she had not looked at the back of this quilt in 60 years of looking at its front, stitching. Quilting stitch, laid close as wheat drills, line against line against line, not an inch of the muslin bare of it. She had known the quilt was well quilted. She had thumbed that stitching through half a century of mendings and thought. When she thought at all, the circle finished it well. Now opened, side lid, inches from her eyes, it told the truth of itself at last. The stitches were all the same length to the 16th, same slant, same small firm bite of the needle, thousands upon thousands of times, edge to edge of a quilt big enough to cover a marriage bed, the way no 20 hands ever sewed in this world, the way no 10 hands ever did. One hand had done this, all of it, alone. Ellen sat very still in the grey light, an old woman holding the underside of her own life, hearing 60 years of a sentence she had misunderstood come slowly right in her ears. Every stitch was a name, for those who knew how to read it. If a quilt that kept a secret for 60 years has taken hold of you, the homestead lantern is where stories like this one are told. But stay with Ellen now. She has just seen the corner of it. Because a hand that will not sign its name still leaves it. 60 years a mending woman, Ellen knew that better than scripture. Thread betrays its owner surer than handwriting ever did. She went over the opened lining inch by inch now, hunting for she knew not what, until, in the bottom corner of the muslin, the low right-hand corner, the same corner where the front of the quilt kept its emptiness, she found it. 2 letters small as a fingernail, worked in thread gone tea-brown with age. Not embroidery meant to be seen, barely raised from the cloth at all. The way a workman scratches his mark under a table he is proud of and will never be asked about. M.S. Ellen's finger stopped beneath the letters, and the window light held, and the house was so quiet she could hear the clock in the next room change its mind about ticking. M.S. in the corner that matched the empty square, on the underside of everything. She was up out of the chair before she knew she meant to stand, the quilt spilling from her lap, and across the room, to the sewing basket she had carried through 5 houses and 1 century. Down through it, spools, needlebook, the beeswax worn to a moon, to the bottom, to the small things a woman keeps, because throwing them out was never once thinkable. A baby's button, a church fair ribbon, and a brass thimble worn to a soft gold shine, with a single line of old country figures cut around its base. She had not worn it in years. It had come to her large, made for a bigger hand than hers ever was. She set it now in her palm and carried it back to the window and put it down on the opened lining beside the 2 brown letters, thimble and mark, the gift and the signature, 60 years apart on 1 square foot of cloth. Marta Solheim, MS. The wagon, the crowd parting, the rough hands closing her fingers over the warm brass. Eat is a long road west. The woman who would not put her name to 1 square in a bright parlor. The woman who had put 10,000 stitches into the dark side of the cloth instead. And there at the window at 84, Ellen Hartley understood, all of it all at once, the way ice goes off a pond, 1 long crack, and then open water. Marta had never signed the square. Marta had had someone's needle held out to her in a warm room before every eye in town, and had shaken her head, and had been called proud for it, and cold and foreign, 60 years worth. But no proud woman quilts a stranger's warmth edge to edge in secret. No cold one gives the thimble off her own finger. The woman had not withheld her name. She had never been able to give it. That was the answer, standing plain at last in the window light. 3 letters of chain stitch in front of the whole circle, for a woman who had never in her life been taught to make them. She could not sign, so she said no once, low, and took the only work that had no name on it, and did it better than anyone, where no one would ever look. Ellen gathered the quilt up into her arms then, wholly lining and all, the way you gather a person, and sat with her cheek against 60 years of hidden stitches, her eyes full and holding, and the grey afternoon went unwatched to dark around her. That evening she sat a long time with the lamp lit, and the thimble standing in her open palm, small and gold, the one bright thing in the room besides the quilt it belonged to. She had carried it through 5 houses. It had ridden west in a flour sack scrap the morning her whole life changed direction, and sat in the bottom of her basket through births and fevers and a burying, and she had never once known what she was keeping. An answer. She had been keeping an answer all this time to the question that sat 6 years in the corner of her bed, and the woman who had handed it up to a wagon wheel, steady-eyed, wet at the rims, saying nothing, had stood at the road's edge watching her carry it away, knowing it could not be understood, and had given it anyway. You could not thank a woman like that with a thought in a lamplit room. Ellen closed her hand over the thimble. It did not warm. Brass takes an old hand's warmth slowly. She held it until it did. She made her mind up the way she had made it up all her life, overnight and completely. Whether the woman herself was living, Ellen could not know. Marta had been in her 40s that gold morning in 1878. The arithmetic said what it said, and Ellen, 84, had stopped arguing with arithmetic. But living or not, she was owed. There was a name that belonged on a quilt, and a town that had clicked its tongue at an empty square for 60 years and never once been told what the emptiness had bought. A wrong does not stop being owed because everyone who did it meant well. It only waits. Ellen wrote to her middle son that she would be traveling east while the weather held. She did not greatly trouble the letter with details, having learned that children of 60 worry worse than children of 6. Then she took her spectacles off and looked across the lamplight at the quilt on the chair. "We're going home," she told it. And a woman who tells a quilt out loud that it is going home has already bought her ticket. She packed the next morning, 1 case, sensible, an old woman's spare, and certain packing. The good dark dress, the letter paper, the sewing kit with needle and dark thread, and the thimble in a knotted handkerchief, riding in the case's inside pocket, like the relic it was. The quilt would not go in the case. It went the way it had come west, folded in her arms, She would carry it on her lap the whole way, she informed the depot agent, who had not asked, and who helped her up the steps, with the particular carefulness men keep for their grandmother's generation. 60 years before, a young wife had carried this quilt out of Dakota on her knees, going west into all her unknowing. Now it rode east on the knees of an old woman who finally knew, back down all those miles, back against the current of her whole life, one bright folded square of color in a dun-colored train car full of dustier faces. The planes went by the window the way they had gone by the wagon, only backward and grey. Where the wheat had stood gold to the world's edge that leaving summer, the fields lay bare or blowing now, fence lines drifted with dust like dirty snow, and every little depot the train breathed past was the same faded photograph of the town it had been. Ellen watched it all pass, with her spine straight and her hands folded on the quilt, and the quilt held its colors against the whole grey window like a stubborn opinion. Somewhere in the long afternoon, her own face came up in the glass, laid over the running country, an old woman's face, silver-crowned, going home with 60 years of wrong to men, and a needle in her case to mend it with. On her lap, under her folded hands, lay the empty square. She had left Havre Creek with a question in that corner. She was coming back with the answer, and one thing more that she meant to say in thread, where the whole town could watch her say it. The woman had not left her name out of the quilt. The quilt had been waiting 60 years for the town to learn how to read it. I hadn't set foot here in 60 years. It had gone grey without me. That is how Ellen said it afterward, and the train window had already told her it would be so. But knowing a thing and standing in it are different weathers. She came down the depot steps into Havre Creek on an October forenoon, one case in her hand and the quilt over her arm, and stood still on the platform boards a long moment, the way you stand when a place and a memory refuse to shake hands. The town was there. The street was where the street had been. The white church still held its corner, gone grey shingled and patient. But the gold was out of everything. The fields beyond the roofs lay bare to a dun sky. Dust silted against the fence lines, and the wind that had once run through wheat all the way to the world's edge came across open ground now, with nothing to say. A town like an old photograph of itself, and through it small and straight-backed, one old woman walking up from the depot, with the only colour in the county, folded over her arm. She had known better than to expect the faces. Even so, the store was a store still, under other names. The parsonage had new porch posts and no memory of her. She said her name to two grey-headed men by the feed scale, Hartley, Ellen Hartley, Jacob Hartley's wife that was, and got courteous nods of the kind you give history. Of the circle itself, she did the arithmetic on headstones, before she ever asked a soul, because at 84, you learn to ask the cemetery first, and be spared the asking twice. The eldest, gone before the century turned surely, the midwife, prudence of the white collar and the decided mouth, the girl who stitched her name crooked and let it stand, an old woman herself now, if she breathed at all, and moved away besides, nobody rightly knew where. 30 women had sewn a town into a quilt for her. She had carried it back to them at last, and she had come very nearly, too late for everyone. The house where the bee had gathered still stood, third past the church, and whether it was boldness or pilgrimage, she knocked, and the young woman renting the rooms let the old lady look. folks did such things in those years of scattered families, and dust took the shine off strangeness. The parlor was smaller than 60 years had told her. Bare floor, a cold stove, the renter's few chairs against the wall. But the window was the window, south light, thin now and grey. And standing in the middle of the little room, Ellen could set it all back in its places without half trying. The frame, here, square in the floor. The lamp, there. The coffee smell, the heaped calico, the dip and rise of a dozen needles. There the eldest had smoothed a red square with her thumb. There the 17-year-old had laughed and picked her letters out. And there, that wall, by the door, half out of the lamplight. An empty chair now, standing where a big quiet woman once sat with her own sewing, evening after evening, on the edge of all that warmth. Ellen looked at that corner the longest. Then she thanked the young woman kindly and went back out into the grey and asked her way to the cemetery. The cemetery had grown the way prairie cemeteries grow, quietly outpacing the town, and she found the stone in the Solheim corner among the other Norwegian names, plain granite, cut with a name and 2 years, and nothing else. Marta Solheim. 1912, the second year said, 26 years in the ground. While Ellen had mended and buried and gone, on supposing her question would keep, it had already stopped keeping, a whole world war and a dust bowl ago. There would be no thanking. That door had shut in 1912. In a town 1,000 miles from where Ellen was sleeping that year, and no one had thought her worth a letter. She stood at the stone a long time, wind pulling at her shawl. Then she took the knotted handkerchief from her pocket and opened it, and set the brass thimble on the shoulder of the granite, where it sat small and gold against all that grey, the one warm thing in the whole field. She let it stand there while she said what she had come to say. That part was between the two of them, and the story leaves it be. But when she turned to go, she took the thimble up again and closed it back into her hand. It was not staying. It had one more piece of work to do. The men at the feed scale had told her where to ask. The Solheim quarter was farmed yet, by the granddaughter and her husband. Ingrid, the name was. The farmhouse sat scoured and swept in the middle of tired land, geraniums fighting for it in a window box, and the woman who opened the door made Ellen's breath catch short, for it was a big-boned, broad-faced woman in her 30s, with pale flaxen hair and pale blue eyes, standing in her doorway with flour on her hands. 60 years fell out of the arithmetic. For one heartbeat it was the edge of a lamplit parlor again. Then the woman smiled, an open, unguarded smile that had never sat on that face in Ellen's remembering, for it was a family face, but not the family weather, and asked kindly what she could do for the visitor. "You'd be Marta Solheim's," Ellen said. It was not a question. Ingrid, her son's daughter. A small tilt of the head, curious as a wren. "You knew my grandmother?" "I did," said Ellen. "I've been 60 years finding out how well. Might I come in? I've something of hers to show you." The kitchen table was scrubbed pine, and the quilt covered the whole of it and hung down at both ends. And Ingrid stood over the bright squares with her flour-dusted hands drawn back, the way people stand over a thing they understand at once to be beyond their household's ordinary. Ellen told it plain, in order, the bee, the leaving, the 29 names, the one square, blank 60 years. She set her finger on it. And her grandmother, who sat every evening at the edge of the light and would not sign, and gave no reason to a town that supplied its own. Then she turned the quilt over. She showed the opened lining, the stitching, close as wheat drills, line against line, edge to edge, laid Ingrid's fingers on it, and watched her feel what any sewing woman feels inside 3 seconds. The sameness, the one hand. And then she walked those fingers to the bottom corner, to 2 small letters gone tea-brown, and said nothing at all, and let the cloth do its own telling. MS, Ingrid said slowly. Her face came up, pale eyes wide. That's... she made this? All of this? Underneath? Every stitch, said Ellen. And I need you to help me understand why she'd not just sign it. You knew her. I had one evening, and a dish of potatoes. Ingrid sat down slowly across the table, and her eyes went from the initials to the middle distance, the place people look when they are going back through a childhood turning over stones. She was quiet, she said at last. Even with us. Kind. She was kind the way a stove is warm. You didn't need it said. But she stopped on something, frowning. There was one thing. I used to carry the post out to her when I was a girl, and she'd never open a letter while you stood there. Grandmother always had someone else read her letters. She said it shamed her. Ingrid gave a small, helpless shrug. I always took it for her eyes. Or the English. She'd have Norwegian letters from her sister, and she'd say her eyes were bad, and Papa would read them out to her after supper. She looked up at Ellen, and Ellen looked back, and said nothing, and waited, because the truth was already in the room now, standing quietly beside the table, and it belonged to Ingrid to turn and see it. Ingrid's gaze went back down, to the 2 thread letters, 2 initials, the shortest writing there is, the writing you choose if writing costs you what it costs the rest of us to lift a wagon. Her flurry hand came up over her mouth. She couldn't, Ingrid said, barely out loud. She couldn't write. Could she? Not even her name. No one had ever taught her. That was the whole of the secret when it finally stood in the light. No crime, no coldness. A crofter's daughter from a Norwegian valley where girls of her year got wool work and water carrying, never letters. And then a ship and a claim and a life of labor. In a country whose words she learned by mouth alone. She could carry a farm through a Dakota winter by herself. She could not make 3 letters with a pen or a needle. And in a town where every wall said otherwise, she had gone 60 years, a lifetime, letting no one see it. Ellen sat in that kitchen and put the last of it together out loud, slowly, the way you set stones over a stream. And this is the shape of what she saw, told before every eye in town. Here is a needle, sign the square. 1 heartbeat to choose. Confess it, plain, in a bright parlor, or shake her head once and let them call it pride. She let them call it pride. And then, picture it, as Ellen made Ingrid picture it, as this story asks you to. A lamp lit late in a farmhouse the town had already gone to sleep on. The borrowed quilt. The muslin stretched. And that big, steady hand, night upon night upon night, laying down the 10,000 stitches of the one language it had, until the whole underside of another woman's warmth was written over, edge to edge, in the only hand its maker ever learned. The greatest gift of the 30, laid where no one would ever look. Signed with the only 2 letters she had ever taught herself. In the corner nobody sees, under the square everybody judged. It was Ingrid who said the town should know, and said it with her chin up and her voice unsteady, in the way of a woman claiming kin out loud for the first time. The pastor was called on, a sober young man for whom 1878 was scripture distant, but who listened to 2 old stories and 1 opened lining, looked rather longer at the lining than a busy man needed to, and offered the church without being asked twice. Sunday after service, he said, word would be put about. Word went about the way it goes in a small dry town starved for anything not weather. By supper, it was general. The daughters and granddaughters of the old circle heard it over fences and counters. The quilt come back after 60 years. Old Mrs. Hartley come back with it. And something found sewn inside that concerned Marta Solheim. That last name traveled with a small silence after it. Enough mothers had clicked their tongues over an empty square, down the years, for the granddaughters to have inherited the click. Havre Creek went to bed uneasy, in a way it could not have explained, and Sunday came on grey and still. They hung it at the front of the church, after the last hymn, from the choir rail, Ingrid on one ladder and her husband on the other, and the pews, which had half emptied toward the door, quietly filled again. 60 years old, and against the grey plank wall of that grey town, it burned like a window into another weather. Madder red, indigo, cream. 29 names in fine dark chain stitch, standing over the congregation like a muster roll of every grandmother in the room. And low in the right-hand corner, plain as a missing tooth, the empty square. They found their own names first. That is, their mothers' names, their grandmothers' names. And you could follow the finding by the small glances past, pew to pew, a woman touching her neighbor's wrist. There, second from the left, that's ours, a quilt of the dead, hung up bright in the town the dead had made. Then the finding quieted, and every eye in that church, without one word being said, settled where every eye had always settled, on the corner, on the blank. Ellen Hartley stood up under the quilt, and she did not raise her voice, because a straight-backed woman of 84 under a thing like that does not need to. She told them what their grandmothers had made her, and what it had been to sleep 60 years under their names. She named the ones she could see in the cloth, and heads went down along the pews as she did, one after another, like wind over barley. Then she said, "You will all have heard all your days about the woman who would not sign." And she took the corner of the quilt and turned the lining out, full to the light. The church made a sound, not words, the sound a roomful of people makes when it takes one breath at the same time, and after it, a silence with weight to it, the silence of 60 years arriving all at once. Those near the front could see the stitching plain, the terrible patient sameness of it, edge to edge, and the 2 small letters in the corner. And those in back saw only the whole white field ripple close with one woman's nights, which was enough. They looked. Nobody moved. On the wall, the work explained itself, the way it had waited 60 years to do, and Havre Creek sat in its pews and let it, because there was nothing in the town to say back. Then Ellen did the thing she had ridden 1,000 miles to do. She had the needle in her collar, threaded that morning with dark thread, the old bee fashion. She took the knotted handkerchief from her pocket and opened it, and her hands not quite steady, and she let them not be, pushed onto her finger the small brass thimble, 60 years warm from its keeping. Marta's thimble. On a Havre Creek finger at last. Ingrid steadied the corner of the quilt, and in the front of that silent church, standing at 84, with her spectacles low on her nose. Ellen Hartley set the needle into the empty square and made the first stitch of a name, M, letter by letter, the chain stitch looping small and sure. A. Her eyes had filled and stood full and did not spill, and her hand did not stop. R. 60 years, 3 letters gone. T. Behind her, the church had risen to its feet somewhere in the working, pew by pew, in silence. Nobody afterward could say quite when. A. Marta. She knotted off and touched the new name once with her thumb, smoothing it. The way 60 years before, in a lamplit parlor across the street, an old woman had smoothed the first name of all and said, "Now wherever you sleep, I'm there before you." What happened next, no one arranged, and that is the whole worth of it. Ellen had turned to find the second word of the name still to make. Solheim, 7 letters, and her hand, honestly, near the end of what it had, when a woman came out of the front pew. Grey-headed, 60-odd, the midwife's daughter, born the same summer as the quilt. She came up without a word and held out her hand for the needle. Ellen gave it to her. She made a letter, an S, careful, her mother's trade in her fingers. And then she turned and held the needle out to the pews. They came one by one. The eldest's granddaughter, Prudence's 2 granddaughters, together, who did their letter with 4 hands. A girl of 17, somebody's youngest, who stitched hers crooked and left it so, and was told by an old voice from the front that crooked kept truest, being hardest won. 7 letters, a dozen hands, passed along that altar rail the way the frame had once gone around the parlor, the descendants of the circle, sewing at last the one name the circle had missed. No speeches were made. A needle went from hand to hand in a grey church, and that was all. And it was enough, and 60 years came right in the time it takes to spell a name out loud. They finished and stepped back, and the quilt hung whole. 30 squares, 30 names. The corner that had held its silence over 3 generations held a name now like all its neighbors. The new dark thread, bright against the old cream. The last signature, gathered in by the daughters of every hand, that had made the first 29. Ellen stood back among them and looked up at it, and said, "To the quilt, to the church, to a woman 26 years under the granite across town. The story has never been sure which, and neither was she. Every stitch was a name for those who knew how to read it, and whether it was the clouds going off the sun that moment, or only what such moments do to the eyes of the people standing in them. Every soul in that church would tell it the same way after, how the light came through the south windows all at once, and the old colours stood up out of the cloth like a shout, madder red, indigo, cream, and the greyest town in the dust years had, for the space of a held breath, a whole harvest summer burning on its church wall. The colour had come back with the name. In that town they never told it any other way. There was no weeping to speak of after, and no speeches either. Havre Creek was Havre Creek still. But this is what was seen. The congregation did not hurry out. They went up in 1s and 2s all that grey afternoon, and stood at the lining where Ellen had left a corner turned, and touched the stitching, most of them once, lightly, the way you touch a thing to be sure of it. The older women stood longest. More than one, turning away, went out past the pews with her eyes down, and her mouth set in the shape their grandmothers' clicking tongues had left them. Worn now to something quieter, that had no click in it at all. Nobody said sorry out loud. There was no one left to say it to. That is the arithmetic of 60 years. And the town stood in it and knew it stood in it. But the pastor, locking up at dusk, left the quilt hanging. It stayed the winter in the end. And it was noticed that from that Sunday, in Havre Creek, when the old empty square story came up at all, it was told differently, told slower, told with the lining out. It was Ingrid, before that winter was out, who set up a quilting frame in her scrubbed kitchen, her grandmother's own frame, fetched down out of the barn loft and waxed, and called in the young women of the town to learn the old custom over again. A signature quilt, she told them, madder red, indigo, and cream. 3 colors and no circus. There was a girl leaving in the spring, marrying west, the way somebody always is. The quilt would go with her, the way one once went with an old woman in that room's grandmother stories. The needles came, the frame filled, the coffee went around, and the lamplight and the dip and rise began again in Havre Creek after 60 years' interruption, as if it had only stepped out to the yard. But the first square, the first name on the new quilt, before the bride's own kin, before anyone, Ingrid claimed for herself and stitched with the brass thimble on her finger. And the room watched the whole of it, the way rooms do when something is starting. Marta Solheim. Every letter whole, chain-stitched, plain in the middle of the cloth, where every eye that ever slept under it would find it first. First name in. There before all of them, wherever they slept. Ellen stayed the winter with Ingrid. There was no argument the younger woman would hear against it. And if you had walked past the Solheim farmhouse at lamplighting time, any evening of that grey December, you would have seen what this story leaves you with. 2 quilts at the south window. The old one, home for good, its 30 names complete at last, madder red, gone soft as memory. The new one on the frame beside it, bride and beginning, 1 name in. 60 years of Dakota between them, and 1 small brass thimble on the sill below, catching the lamplight in its warm gold. Done traveling. The old folks of the prairie said a house showed its heart at its windows, and they were right. And it was never the curtains. It was a candle set out for a stranger, a lamp left burning for the sick. And once, in a grey town in the dust years, 2 quilts and a thimble, saying in thread what Havre Creek had taken 60 years to learn how to hear, that the ones who love you do not always sign, that the plainest square may be the fullest, and that a name, even 60 years late, especially 60 years late, is worth every stitch it takes. Every stitch is a name. Look close and read who loved you.